Well, hey there. You're listening to the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate those stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. Well, I am here today with a very special co-host, my colleague Mike Holden, who is BCA's chief economist, and we are joined by a very, very special guest, former Premier of Alberta and the longest standing immigration minister for Canada, the Honourable Jason Kenney. On this episode, we are talking about all things immigration. We take a little journey back to 2008 to 2013 when Mr. Kenney served as immigration minister, and we hear a little bit more about his work and impact on that file. And we also talk about the state of immigration today and discuss what Canadians are currently feeling about how we are approaching immigration. And we get his thoughts on what Canada needs to do to not just be a destination for immigration, but the destination. Now on to the show. Well, Mr. Kenney, it is an honor to have you on the podcast, on The Brief. I can't imagine there being many people in Alberta or Canada who don't know who you are. But to start us off, can you introduce yourself and tell our listeners what's been keeping you busy since leaving government?
Sure. Well, I just finished 25 years of public service. I was born in Ontario, grew up in the West, college in the States, and after which I helped to start the Canadian Taxpayers Federation here in Alberta and was very much involved in the fiscal battles of the early and mid 90s and the development of what some people now call the Chrétien consensus, although it really started here with Ralph Klein and Albertans demanding fiscal responsibility. I ran for Parliament back in 1997, served about 10 years in opposition, and then about 10 years in government, serving in Prime Minister Harper's cabinet as Minister of, well, actually, I was the longest ever serving Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, which will bring us to today's subject. I was also Minister of Employment and Social Development, which is the biggest department, and then a Minister of Defense. And through all 9-10 years, I was also Minister of Multiculturalism because I was leading the efforts of the government to reach out to Canada's ethnic and cultural communities. And then, as you know, more recently served in the provincial legislature and government. So since then, I've been happily developing lots of new opportunities in the private sector. I'm on a bunch of corporate boards, some advisory work. I'm doing this from Bennett Jones, where I'm a senior advisor, and doing some consulting and also some think tank and charity work. So I'm congenitally busy and I'm really enjoying the opportunities in the private sector.
Yeah, you mentioned the longest serving immigration minister from about 2008 to 2015. I'm curious what that experience was like in that late 2000s to early 2010s, and how might that experience with what the current immigration minister is going through right now?
Yeah, so I was a Minister of Immigration from 08 to 13, so about 5 years. But I must say that because of my role in multiculturalism, I was sort of immigration adjacent for pretty much the whole decade of the Harper government. Ask anybody who is familiar with Canadian immigration policy, and I think they will tell you, regardless of their political views, that I led an ambitious program of pretty fundamental reform to the immigration system, which had not been attempted for a very long time, in part because immigration had come to be regarded with great fear and trepidation by politicians in Ottawa as the third rail. You touch it and you die, because of all of the complicated sensitivities around how you select immigrants, which intersects with all sorts of other issues about race and ethnicity. So and there had been a series of immigration ministers who had to resign because they had, well, at least a couple of them had been found to use their ministerial powers for political preferences in some cases. I had succeeded a string of ministers going back 10 or 15 years who had typically served only 1 to 2 years. So Prime Minister Harper gave me the privilege of a long time there to really get to know the complexity of immigration policy. And because of multiculturalism, I was always out there listening to new Canadians about their perspective on the system and what was working, what was broken. That gave me the confidence to do fundamental reforms, because there's a lot of multi-generational Canadians who look like me, who think that all newcomers to Canada want is a wide open door. And nothing could be further from the truth. I found that most new Canadians are actually, God bless them, very jealous about protecting Canada's best interests and see most clearly the abuse of our generosity that too often occurs. And so I launched an ambitious program of reform designed, first of all, to reinforce the integrity of the system because there was far too much fraud across the system. Asylum claims that had created a massive backlog and really broken that system, widespread citizenship and residency and immigration marriage fraud, et cetera. What I called bogus immigration consultants that were facilitating a lot of this stuff. So I realized that if you're going to maintain wide public support for pretty high levels of immigration, it has to be a system that is characterized by the consistent application of fair rules. If people are sneaking in the back door, what's the point of coming through the front door? And if it's not an orderly system through the front door, you lose public support. So we went about fundamental asylum reform, greater stringency in the citizenship program, a greater focus on civic literacy, a longer period of residency to qualify for citizenship. We brought in a conditional period for sponsored spouses before they got their permanent residency to stop some of the people showing up and immediately leaving their spouse, sponsoring spouse. We cracked down on unscrupulous immigration consultants with a new law and a new regulator. And I could go on for the whole podcast to detail the things we did on the integrity side. But then we also did some radical improvements to the selection of economic immigrants, including the launch of the express entry system, which was the new and improved federal skilled worker or point system. We got a better geographic selection of immigrants across the country through a huge expansion of the provincial nominee programs and much more. But the point is, it was a very busy 5 years. One academic who followed this closely, a professor at Queen's, said that it used to be that you could take a sabbatical for a year, come back, and immigration policy in Canada would not have changed. But now if I go downstairs to get a coffee, by the time I come back to my desk, Kenney's already changed a couple of laws. So it was a hyperactive period of reform.
Very productive, it sounds like.
Thanks for that. I think maybe I want to turn the discussion over to economic immigration, which you just touched on. So a lot of the work that we've done here at the Business Council over the last year or so is focused on the selection of economic immigrants in Canada. And it's prefaced on this idea that immigration has been considerably beneficial for Canada for decades and decades and far longer still, and that immigration can lead to solid economic growth and prosperity gains, not just for the immigrants themselves, but for Canada as a whole. And I'm wondering about whether you can share with us your observations from having been minister about the relationship between immigration, economic growth, and productivity.
Sure. In principle, yes, immigration can lead to all of those positive things. And we know that with an aging society and a shrinking birth rate, that we do need newcomers to deal with those demographic trends. And we also know that in Canada, broadly speaking, over our history, we have a positive story about immigration and the contribution to our prosperity. However, these things cannot and must not be taken for granted. Because what we've actually seen, I think, under the current government, and I don't mean to be partisan about this, but they have gone in many respects in the opposite direction of what we know to be sound immigration policy. First of all, jacking up the numbers, I think arbitrarily, I think in part for political reasons. And now all the focus there is on the huge expansion of temporary residents, students, and temporary foreign workers. But I, for one, believe that effectively doubling the permanent residency target from roughly 260,000 to 500,000 without the capacity properly to settle those people and without a focus on selecting economic immigrants who we know have the human capital which is most likely to lead to success. Without those factors in play, what we have in fact seen is a decade-long reduction in per capita gross domestic product in Canada. And there is one absolute consistent fact in immigration experience across the developed world, which is this: very high levels of immigration tend to be correlated with declining per capita GDP. This is not an anti-immigration statement. This is a challenge that we have to overcome as an immigrant receiving country. And here's the problem. Generally speaking, newcomers, when they start their lives in Canada, end up at lower levels of income. They don't have Canadian work experience. They're often struggling to get their credentials recognized. They don't have typically the soft social networks, which make it easier to get employment and references, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes language challenges. So all of those challenges combined tend to equal lower incomes. And then if you're selecting a large number of newcomers, not at all based on their human capital or their ostensible economic skills, but other reasons like the humanitarian class, refugees, family reunification, large numbers of dependents who come with primary economic immigrants who may not speak English or have relevant employment skills, then you see that torque down in average incomes accelerate. And that's exactly what's happened under this current government. So I think when we look at the dashboard of immigration in Canada right now, many of the lights are blinking, they're flashing. That's why I think we need to take a step back and recalibrate. First of all, reduce the intake numbers until we can get a handle on this, and recalibrate policy around those things we know are more likely to lead, on the whole, to financial and economic success. And that's why I'm glad the Business Council of Alberta has been leading a project focused on exactly that.
Thanks for saying that. And do want to actually ask you about this process for selecting economic immigrants. So in the research that we did in lead up to the recent final report here, it became clear to us that the current point system as it's presently constructed that's used to select economic immigrants on the basis of the points generated for various attributes, that there are several known factors that people know are good determinants of economic success for immigrants, but for one reason or another aren't reflected in the scoring or evaluating system that's used to decide who we send out invitations to. I wonder if you could talk about what some of those are and why do you think they're not reflected in the scoring system today?
If you look at the academic research on this, which I think is also comes to some pretty common sense conclusions, you'll see that the factors most likely to be correlated to economic success for newcomers are English language proficiency, specifically do mean English. I think French language proficiency, very important in Quebec, but that is the number one factor. Age, younger immigrants tend to do better than older ones because they're more adaptable and they have a longer lifespan in Canada to sort of move up the income ladder. Relevant education, because an engineer in Canada is not necessarily an engineer in anything close to the same standard in certain other countries. And so we've always had this credential recognition problem, but relevant education, so education that would be recognized by a Canadian employer or credentialing body immediately or very quickly, would be critically important. And so those are the three top factors. And that's what I designed the reformed point system and the express entry system around in terms of human capital. But I understand the changes have since been made, and that may in part reflect on the diminishing outcomes that we see for many selected economic immigrants.
And that kind of leads me to another question or related to that. So you highlighted English proficiency and relevant education, especially at a Canadian institution, as being factors that we know are strong determinants of success. And I guess one criticism of that has been that if we more thoroughly embrace those specific factors and reflect them higher or weight them higher in the point system, that skews the countries from which immigrants would tend to come. So you'd end up biasing the system in favor of immigrants who come from countries where English language proficiency is more common or where they're more likely to come to Canada to be international students. I wonder if you could talk about what your view of that criticism is, that we've got this changing the system from what it is now would create an inherent bias in who it is we end up selecting as an economic immigrant.
I think the opposite is true. I think that basing the selection of economic immigrants on objective factors, which we know are more likely to lead to economic and social integration and success, I think is the best way to avoid bias. And rigging it so that to downgrade those factors, which we know based, I mean, as somebody who's a political conservative, I'm always being lectured about the importance of evidence-based, data-driven policy. I think immigration policy should be based on evidence and data and not arbitrary selection criteria designed to get some perceived balance of countries of origin. I don't think there should be any discrimination in the immigration system with respect to countries of origin or people's culture. And that thankfully has been the case in Canadian law since 1958 under Minister Fairclough, the Diefenbaker government that eliminated country of origin discrimination. But let me just say this, there are no shortage of people around the world, including developing countries, who have high levels of English language proficiency. We should not apologize for selecting the people who are most likely to address our labor market needs, contribute to our productivity as a country, contribute to our tax base, contribute to our overall economy, and who will integrate well. And I have always believed, by the way, when it comes to like the issues, trickier, more abstract issues around like social cultural integration, I've always believed that the most successful pathway to social integration comes from successful and rapid economic integration. And the key for all of that is language proficiency. I'm not saying that we have, look, we've obviously have a happy history of newcomers in different eras who came to Canada with limited or no English language proficiency, and they just, through the sweat of their brow, they bootstrapped it up the ladder in this country. God bless them. Think of the Ukrainians who settled the northern Canadian prairies, for example, 120 years ago. And many people come here with limited language proficiency, and through enormous effort, they end up getting ahead. But I'm just telling you, based on the data, that people with a high level of English language proficiency are massively ahead when it comes to the chance of economic success in Canada. And that's not something that we should ignore.
You just described my family immigrating into Alberta. They were all kind of from what at the time was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is currently sort of the Ukraine, Russian-speaking are part of Ukraine. But it was that exact story. Yeah.
But let me just say, Mike, that I love that story. It's part of our identity. It's part of the romantic narrative of Canada's settlement. But that was when we were looking for people willing to plow virgin soil and clear tough land in small farms, far-flung rural communities. We're now in a knowledge economy. Overwhelmingly, the newcomers who are settling are coming to urban areas. And so the notion that we should use the same selection criteria as Clifford Sifton did in 1905, I think that obviously it's a wonderful part of our story, but it's not necessarily relevant to a 21st century knowledge economy.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about more so like the immigration system itself, the policy decisions, and some of the changing perceptions among Canadians and changing sentiment among Canadians about immigration. So we recently partnered with Abacus Data to poll Canadians and get their sense of how effective they view the current system. And less than half of Canadians believe that the system as we have it today is effective.
Yeah.
Ineffective actually in managing processes, selecting candidates, integrating newcomers. Like 28% think that it's actually effective. And what is even more than that, like less than half of Canadians are currently of the view that immigration is good for Canada. If we looked at this data point 5 years ago, back in 2018, that number would be 80%, but we're down to less than half. So why do you think, given, your massive history with this file, why do you think people are feeling that way? What are some of the markers that you're seeing that are maybe driving some of this
Sure.
sentiment?
I always used to say that in order to maintain the broadly pro-immigration consensus in Canada's political culture, people needed to see that the system was based on integrity, like fair rules, and secondly, that immigration was working for Canada. And people see neither of those things right now as increasingly they're losing confidence in the system. On the side of integrity, let me tell you, when people see the government of Canada has basically facilitated mass filing of bogus asylum claims by people just crossing the border from the United States, a rights respecting liberal democracy, when they see that kind of stuff, they say, hey, what's going on? But what's the point of the front door if they're just telling anybody they can come up here through the back door? That's why, by the way, you see anti-immigration backlash in jurisdictions like the United States and Europe, where there is the highest incidence of irregular migration. It undermines public confidence in the system. And let me stress, this is not a question of prejudice or racism, because immigrants are more likely to hold those views consistently in the public opinion research than native-born Canadian, in part because they're closest to it. They see the integrity issues up front. Secondly, immigrants are also generally more likely to say we should have lower levels or the current system is not working well. And that's for a number of reasons, one of which so many immigrants come here. Many go through the rigorous selection process for skilled workers, et cetera. And then they arrive only to find themselves being unemployed or underemployed, often stuck in survival jobs, waiting to get their credentials recognized, unable to get jobs at the skill level where they practiced in their countries of origin because they don't have Canadian experience, et cetera. So there's those initial barriers to economic integration. People often say, well, hell, hold on. You, the federal government, recognized my graduate degree for purposes of the point system, but none of these employers seem to, and my provincial regulatory body doesn't either. So there's that lack of coherence between immigration selection criteria and the actual practical economy for a lot of folks that frustrates them. And then I think finally, people just see that the numbers have gotten out of hand. Like you don't need a PhD to realize that the housing crisis, the unaffordability of housing and much else in Canadian life has been driven in part by this factor. I mean, look, you talk about food bank usage has tripled in the past decade in Canada. Food bank usage. What's one of the big factors driving that? I'll be blunt. Foreign students telling themselves on their discussion groups, their WhatsApp groups, et cetera, that in Canada you can get free food and this is one way you can reduce your cost of living. So there's this huge new clientele, people on study permits, who are now regular clients of food banks, and many of whom these poor young kids are good kids, I'm sure, overwhelmingly just ambitious young people who are trying to do well for themselves and their families. But they're now living in some cases 10 or 20 to an apartment, sleeping in shifts since the federal government started giving students full-time work permits.
Hmm.
So if you're a new Canadian and came here through a permanent resident, selected economic immigrant, but you can't afford housing, and you see this happening around you, you're probably going to say that the system is broken. So I think that is a growing sentiment, and I think this is a real problem. And I urge business groups like the BCA, who are typically very pro-immigration, because they look at it from very typically business leaders just look at this as, or primarily look at it as a question of filling skills gaps, labor market shortages, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we all need to take a step back and look at the broader social reality that more is not always better, especially if it starts undermining public support for immigration.
Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned that it's more likely to be immigrants themselves who would oppose higher immigration levels. And so that kind of speaks, I suppose, and I guess this is more of a question than a statement. And do you think that that's just because their own experience was underwhelming when they came to Canada? Because I guess because of all the things you just mentioned. And so I guess in that context, one of the things that we were trying to do in our work was looking at ways to deepen the talent pool of applicants. And so I'm wondering whether you think that there are real concerns about some of the knock-on effects, that if somebody comes to Canada, have a data point that we found that a third of all immigrants that came to Canada either regretted or were not sure that they made the right choice in coming here, which to me is a terrible number. But if immigrants come to Canada and they don't get their credentials recognized, they can't find housing that they can afford to live in, they can't find work in the area that they want to work in, what impact do you think that has on sort of the future of the talent pool of
Well,
applicants who want to come?
it diminishes that future talent pool. One thing that I strongly agree with in the BCA immigration paper is recognition that Canada is part of a global migration market for talent.
Mm.
And we Canadians sometimes we get way too self-satisfied. We keep telling ourselves we're the place everybody wants to move to, and that leads to, I think, a degree of passivity on our part. The truth is this, that in a world of 8 billion people, 80% of whom live in developing countries or much lower income countries, there is almost infinite desire and pressure for migration. And those people, like those most likely to succeed, based on the criteria that the data underscores, younger, English speaking people with higher levels of relevant education, for example, they can pick and choose. And you just need to look at this in terms of the flow of foreign students, where the most sought after places for foreign students to go to are the United States, first tier universities, and then the United Kingdom. Canada is seen as respectable, but we're not seen as having the same level of prestige or opportunity. By the way, by far the busiest website for the Government of Canada is the Immigration Department website. There are these discussion groups, online discussion groups, with millions of participants in real time sharing information on where's the best country to immigrate to, where are you most likely to get good employment, what are the housing costs, what are the incomes, what are the challenges in the system, how welcoming are these places. So we are in a real time dynamic competition in trying to attract highly skilled immigrants. And if the word on the street is that, like, I'll just share with you, I met a couple of very brilliant pediatric oncologists in Toronto just by coincidence not long ago. And both of them speak multiple languages. They're doing a residency at a hospital in Toronto. And I'm trying to help them. Like, I want them to stay in Canada. These guys would be just ideal immigrants for all sorts of obvious reasons. Both speak fluent English, they've enormous medical experience and expertise. And they're having a hard time getting through the system. If they say that to their circle of peers and friends that they went to medical school with, it has an impact on our brand and our reputation. Sadly, many of the newcomers who come to Canada end up returning to their countries of origin
Mm-hmm.
and with unhappy stories. So I guess your point, Mike, is very well taken. If we want to meet or beat our competition in a global talent competition, we've got to do a better job.
And I think also part of that too is that a lot of the countries that are traditional sources of immigrants into Canada, India comes to mind as an example. I mean, those economies are growing rapidly. They're developing quickly. The economies are growing. And as their economic status converges with that of Canada, the value proposition of coming here also tends to fall too, or it narrows at least for the highest value immigrants.
That's absolutely true. I know that in 1991, when the Mulroney government gave Quebec the power to select their own economic immigrants, ostensibly to emphasize Francophone immigrants, I think Quebec imagined that in their new French immigration system, they were going to attract a ton of people from France. That never really happened because if you're, upper middle class person in France, the economic advantage of moving to Canada is at best negligible. It certainly, in most cases, would not justify all of the dislocation and the transaction costs. So that's why we typically don't see a lot of migration from prosperous countries. And as many developing countries become more prosperous, that will increasingly be the case.
So let me ask you about what Canada does need to do to be an attractive place for immigrants, because one of the things that we found out about and uncovered in our research is that the United States has a strong record of attracting very high value or high value economic immigrants. And the main reason for that is that the US is seen as a fast growing, dynamic entrepreneurial economy that creates lots of opportunity. And so if you have an economy like that, it tends to attract the kinds of immigrants who would succeed and are interested in those kinds of things. And so you create kind of a virtuous cycle
Right.
of high value immigrants. And so contrast that to Canada, where GDP per capita is at what 2018 levels right now. It's been falling for a while. Productivity has been falling. And I'm wondering whether, and especially if you take that in the context of increasing numbers of permanent resident targets, or the number of people we're looking to bring in. And so if you increase the number of permanent residents and economic immigrants within a fixed talent pool, or an arguably fixed talent pool, you're digging deeper into that pool in order to select immigrants. And then on top of that, if you don't have a strong economy that's attracting the best and brightest, I guess, what impact do you think that has on the talent pool? And I guess I'm wondering, what do you think we need to do to become a more attractive place for immigrants so that Canada could become the place that immigrants want to come?
In your question is a hugely important insight, which is increasingly ignored in Ottawa because it seems like they approach immigration policy with heavily influenced by the kind of symbolic virtue signaling characteristic of the current federal government and many in the academy, which is all about diversity and inclusion and so forth. Those things are important. I think they just happen naturally and organically, obviously, in a diverse society like ours. But nobody ever chose to immigrate to Canada in order to live in a seminar on diversity. Why do they choose to come to developing countries like Canada? Overwhelmingly for economic opportunity. That is predicated on things like the rule of law, having constitutionally protected freedoms and so forth. But it is ultimately, overwhelmingly about economic opportunity. And Canada now, regrettably, has the equivalent per capita gross domestic product of Alabama, the poorest of the 50 United States. Now, by the way, I should say, Mike, that while the US is the number one choice of immigrants around the world, if they have a choice, and certainly for foreign students, we benefit from the fact that their immigration system is so broken. You get these super brilliant kids going to the top US research institutes, and they don't really have a clear pathway to permanent residency. They have to go on J-1B visas, which are like glorified temporary foreign workers. And if they're lucky, they'll get drawn in the green card lottery. Meanwhile, it seems that anybody that wants to can pay a coyotes as part of a Mexican cartel to cross the border illegally and go in through the back door of the asylum system. So their system is a bit of a gong show. I've sounded like I've been quite critical. The truth is that we have benefited by having a pretty good immigration system over recent decades. I think mistakes have been made in recent years. They can be corrected. But for whatever challenges we have economically, for the diminishing per capita GDP and productivity and investment, for all of those things you talk about at the BCA a lot, Canada is still a world-leading economy. We still have a lot about us that's attractive. We need to fix some of these issues, like, for example, credential recognition, cost of housing, affordability. And if we could get major investment back in our economy, unleash our resource industries, and move back up that per capita GDP ladder, I think Canada would once again be a top country of choice.
Absolutely. I think I can maybe close off my last question for you here, kind of putting you on the spot a bit. So we met you, my colleague Alicia and I met with you in the fall, I think, as we were doing some research on this project. And one of the things that stood out to me about that conversation was you had talked to me about how, in your experience with immigration when you were minister, that you had kind of identified who the ideal economic immigrant to Canada was, sort of their sort of demographic characteristics and so on. I wonder if you could tell our listeners what that person looks like.
Well, based on the data, if you wanted to create a kind of archetype of somebody who's most likely to do very well, it would be a foreign student who has done their degrees at a Canadian university, a first-tier university, who has perfected their English language skills, is in their early 20s, and already has at least some Canadian work experience. Based on the data, somebody with those factors is, within a decade, they are almost certain to be generating far more income than the median average in the Canadian economy. So because of their adaptability, their flexibility, the compatibility of their diploma, their degrees, they're likely to go to the top very quickly. Now, that might beg the question, well, then what's the problem with all the foreign students that we have? Part of the problem is the vast majority of that huge, I think it's like 8-fold increase in study permits of foreign students have not been in full degree programs, and certainly not graduate and postgraduate degree programs at our top research universities. The vast majority of that flow has been to the tertiary post-secondary sector, to community colleges and private career colleges with affiliate agreements with publicly funded community colleges. So these are typically like 1-year diploma programs, many of them at quite dodgy institutions, where basically in many cases, this is true in Ontario, they're acting as a front for immigration agents who are getting paid to get those study permits, linking them up with dodgy institutions here that have connections to public career colleges. And I think you've probably read about this. It's become a mess. So let me be clear. A young person who's getting a diploma from a diploma mill that does not offer real programming, and which diploma is not going to be recognized in the Canadian labor market at a 1-year program like what I'm describing, is not at all in the same category as somebody who's, let's say, done their graduate studies at a Canadian research university. So we've got, and by the way, the growth in study permits in that category of like degree granting universities has been relatively small. Almost all of the growth has been in that tertiary sector. Not necessarily all of that is bad, but with the full-time work permits, it basically, many of those young people are coming here to work, and the diploma mill is an excuse for that.
That was gold.
But that's really at the heart of a lot of what we're dealing with right now.
Yep.
So as we wrap our conversation, Mr. Kenney, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share? And if there's one takeaway that you wish our listeners would take away from this conversation, what would you want that to be?
Well, we should be grateful that Canada is a country built in part on the hard work and talents of newcomers. We should also be grateful that we've been one of the only developed democracies in the world that has had a pretty broad pro-immigration political consensus. But we shouldn't take those things for granted. We need to be intentional about it. And we need to see the lights that are flashing on the dashboard right now. Obviously, the broader economic indicators, the declining per capita GDP, declining productivity and investment, we need to turn all of those things around. Mm-hmm. And for me, that means we should have a more rational data-based immigration policy, more realistic numbers that are aligned with our capacity to integrate, house, and employ people based on those criteria we know are most likely to lead to success, while at the same time reinforcing the integrity of the system, because that reinforces public confidence in it. I have the confidence that we have the ability to do that as Canadians. We've done it in the past. We can do it again in the future.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, Mr. Kenney, for joining us on this episode. It has been an absolute honor to speak with you this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. And this podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on X, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.